The challenge, the opportunity to connect. The 1960s, a time of imagination and change, a time of anger and fear. The 1960s, a program called Challenge.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
Looked at our connections, our divisions, through the lens of faith. Nearly 60 years later, during these challenging times, we'll take a new look at our divisions, our connections, in a new program called Challenge 2.0. 2 years ago, a young teenage Muslim woman wrote a letter to then President Barack Obama. In it, Alena Khan said, "I am an American. I grew up here. I say the Pledge of Allegiance every day, and yet I am a Muslim. Which one am I allowed to be?" It is a question increasingly answered not by Muslims, but by others. Frequently, one or the other, but not both. Since 2016, when young Alena wrote that letter, some political and religious leaders more vocally contend what's come to be called Islamophobia is only a Muslim problem. But an increasing number of political, religious, and business leaders disagree. We'll explore their thoughts in this episode of Challenge 2.0, Islamophobia, not just a Muslim problem. Well, thank you and welcome to Challenge 2.0, and a big welcome and thank you to each of our guests today. First, I'd like to introduce Aneelah Afzali, who is a return guest. Thank you so much for coming back. A Harvard-trained attorney, Aneelah turned from the practice of law to advance social justice in what we might call the courtroom of public opinion. Aneelah serves now as the executive director of MAPS Amen, Muslim Association of Puget Sound, American Muslim Empowerment Network. Aneelah, thank you so much for joining us again.
Thank you for having me back.
Our next guest is Imam Jamal Rahman, who serves as the Muslim Sufi minister at Interfaith Community Sanctuary in Seattle, and is one of the 3 Interfaith Amigos. Together with his friends and colleagues, a Jewish rabbi and a Protestant minister, Jamal travels widely. I looked at your schedule. It's amazing, your travel schedule. And is also a multiple published author, and you focus on interfaith community building. Thank you so much for joining us,
Delighted
Jamal.
to be here. Thank you.
Reverend Terry Kyllo is often found working with Aneelah in what they call Faith Over Fear, Standing with Our Muslim Neighbors Roadshow. And Roadshow is probably a good description because you've gone all over. An ordained Lutheran pastor, you serve as both executive director of the Tracy Levine Center, same organization for which I serve on the board, and as directors for Neighbors in Faith, a partnership of churches and mosques. So, Terry, thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeff.
What I'd like to open with on this issue of Islamophobia is what example have most troubled you? And Aneelah and Jamal, I might start with you. What example of Islamophobia most sticks in your mind and bothers you?
Well, we know that Islamophobia is on the rise both at a personal level and beyond. We've seen hate crimes increase at such a significant rate, and we are living right now at a time where hate crimes against Muslims or those perceived as Muslim are at unprecedented levels. And if I tell people, those are just statistics until you actually know some of the faces and the names and the individuals behind some of those statistics. So like I know some of the people who, for instance, a friend of mine whose father-in-law was murdered, hit with a shovel while he was praying outside in Portland, Oregon. Or I know the surviving family of the MAX train attack. And perhaps that stands out to me as one of the most egregious examples because it shows that Islamophobia doesn't just hurt American Muslims, it hurts everybody. We had Christian white men who were the victims of Islamophobia there in the Portland MAX train incident.
Thank you. Jamal.
Yeah, and for me, one of my concerns is that there is so much of misrepresentation of the Quran, the holy book of Muslims. And if I may quickly explain, in the Quran, like in all holy books, there are 2 kinds of verses. One is particular verses, other one is universal verses. Particular verses are in desperate need of textual and historical context. Universal verses are timeless, placeless, and filled with wisdom. The problem is, we take a particular verse and say that this is actually a universal verse. Or you take a particular verse from the Quran and you compare it to a universal verse from the, say, Christian scriptures. That presents a distorted image of the teachings of Islam.
Terry, I might give you a slightly different question, and that is, what response or lack of response, perhaps, of the Christian community to Islamophobia has most bothered you?
There actually are a lot of Christian congregations that are trying to form Christian community in a dangerous and cheap way. The easiest way to form a community is to define yourself by some other, by some enemy. And I'm afraid that a lot of Christians, certainly not all of them, but there are a lot of Christian churches and pastors like Franklin Graham who are choosing to define themselves and build group cohesion against what really is a false image of our Muslim neighbors.
Speaking of false images, I might ask, what would you most like, and Jamal, you sort of alluded to this, what would you most like people to understand about Islam, or what misunderstandings do you think are in most need of correction?
It's very important to point out that Islam is a very diverse religion. It's in every part of the world, 1.7 billion people. I'm from Bangladesh, which is more than a few blocks away from here. The third or fourth largest Muslim country. The Islam of Bangladesh is different from the Islam of Saudi Arabia. In Bangladesh, women have been driving cars for decades. We've always had, for the last 25 years, a woman who is a prime minister. In Saudi Arabia, it's just recently that they're allowed to drive. And it's unthinkable that a woman could be the ruler. Yet, I want to quickly point that, this is not a nuanced answer, because there are contradictions. In Saudi Arabia, which I'm telling you is a very conservative Muslim country, the UN statistic shows that 40% of private wealth is in the hands of women. 40% of doctors in Saudi Arabia are women. 60% of university enrollees are women. In Iran, where it's a conservative country, there are many women who have more PhDs than men do. The answer is never simple.
Aneelah.
And I would add to that, certainly that idea that Islam is not a monolith, that there's a lot of diversity historically and today, and that the Muslim majority countries, there are so many. There's about 50 Muslim majority countries in the world, and they vary, just as Imam Rahman mentioned. And in addition to that, we have about 80 countries where Muslims are a sizable minority of 10% or more. So those also vary. But some of the things that I personally really like to emphasize to people when I talk about Islam and help them understand this is some of the areas that the Islamophobia industry, this industry of anti-Muslim hate groups, have spread misinformation. And one of the most popular areas of attack that they use is women's issues. And Jamal, you alluded to that already. You mentioned some statistics. I like to give some more. I like to talk about the fact that not just today, but also throughout Islamic history, at the time of Prophet Muhammad, for instance, peace be upon him, we had women in positions of power. He went to women for advice. He appointed women to positions of power. Women owned businesses. They played a part in society, in the public sector, and we've had Muslim majority countries that have had female heads of state in many different ways. We've had women sort of advance in a variety of ways, both historically and even today. So that's an area that a lot of people have a misinformation or misunderstanding, in part because of media representations and the portrayal of Muslim women by some of these anti-Muslim groups and some of the behavior of certain Muslims in Muslim majority countries today. But I really like to emphasize that there's so much diversity, and there is no one version of Islam. It varies over time. It varies in different countries today. It varies in even within families. And I'm the only one of my sisters who wears a head covering, and I choose to do so. So there's a lot of diversity and variety, and that's a good thing, just like with any other religion.
Terry.
Well, in the roadshow that I've done with Aneelah, there are so many questions that are that we get, but the one I would bring up today is, what's the relationship between Islam and other faith traditions? And one of the things that's really important for people to know is that Islam recognizes the validity of other faith traditions, calls Christians and Jews and other monotheistic traditions the people of the book. And that the Prophet Muhammad saw Islam as a continuation of the Abrahamic tradition. So much so that the Prophet Muhammad actually had spouses who were Christian. And he encouraged those spouses to remain Christian.
And Jewish.
And Jewish, thank you. And so there's images out there about Islam that just simply are not true. Again, really represented by the Islamophobia industry, which is really attempting to bear false witness against our Muslim neighbors. And And for those of us in the Abrahamic tradition, that's one of the 10 commandments, is not to bear false witness against your neighbors.
What I'd like to do, and we're going to get in greater detail on that issue, but it always strikes me, and I've had that as a personal experience as a meteorologist, one who is trained in science, that a lot of people don't have an appreciation, not only the major advances that Islamic scientists or researchers have provided culturally, artistically, but in science and mathematics and medicine. Could you maybe elaborate on a few examples of that people may not be aware of?
Sure, there are so many. If you look at the Islamic Golden Age, right, we have surgical tools that were introduced by Muslims that are still in use today, like the scalpel. We have some of the highest sort of technologies at the time with hospitals, the first university in the world, advancements within astronomy, coffee, which I am a huge fan of.
I should also add, so much advancement in really becoming a more complete human being,
right.
What is called mystical sciences. You might know that the sage poet Rumi, 13th century, for the last 25 years has been the most popular poet in the West. People dismiss him saying he's a Sufi. Well, what is a Sufi? Sufi is just someone who practices the spirituality of Islam. Rumi is actually an Islamic theologian. And why is he so popular? Because he, like many other Sufi sages, they focus so much on the critical need, no matter what your religion. The main purpose is to really evolve into the fullness of your being by transforming your ego, opening up your heart, and being of service to God's creation. So Rumi has brought incredible popularity of this term, let's open up our hearts. I'll give you just one poetry. Rumi never wrote, by the way, he just uttered by going into trance. He says, please, close down speech's door and open the window of your heart. The moon will kiss you only through the window. And he's following a Quranic injunction. The heart is mentioned 132 times in the Quran. Open for me my heart. So a lot of our work today is really to find ways, doesn't matter what your tradition or no tradition, how can I create that inner spaciousness?
I just want to add too that Sufism was one of the driving forces for people accepting Islam. The spread of Islam was through Sufism and that mysticism of Islam.
I'm delighted that you know that. Because many Muslims are not aware of their own tradition about people like Ibn Arabi, Rumi, Sadi. They sometimes have a bias against that.
I think that's true in many faiths, that there's a lack of information, a lack of awareness of some of the true foundations of those faiths.
Well, and Christians as well may not know that during the Middle Ages, a lot of Western scholars lost some of the ancient languages and even the ancient documents of the Greco-Roman world especially, and it was the Islamic scholars that reintroduced those languages and those texts back into Western society.
So if they had not done that, that would have been truly lost. Absolutely. Let's move on to the next question. And Terry, I'm going to begin with you, and that is, we've been talking about Islamophobia. Let's look at the impacts of it, and it might be useful to start with the impacts of Islamophobia, not on the Muslim community, but on non-Muslims and all Americans by extension.
It's good for me to feel fearful if I'm going to cross the road, right? Because my brain wants me to keep me alive. But if I begin to fear things that I really don't have a reason to fear, my own life, my own sense of well-being begins to get diminished. And the reality is that if people have been trained, in essence, to fear our Muslim neighbors, they also begin to fear their Jewish neighbors, their Latino neighbors, and on and on and on. And human beings begin to forget how to recognize other human beings, which is, in my view, at the heart of the Christian tradition, of the Abrahamic tradition, to help us recognize other human beings.
So Aneelah and Jamal, I might ask you, how do you feel Islamophobia has most damaged or hurt people within your communities?
When there is fear, and there is excessive fear, there's a verse in the Quran that says, what happens is when there's chronic fear, anger, hopelessness, helplessness, it's not that the eyes become blind, the hearts become blind. Then you're capable of saying and doing all kinds of crazy things. Essentially, if I or someone else is a victim or survivor of Islamophobia, constant fear it makes me lose my sense of identity. It makes me lose my sense of belonging. And I become dysfunctional, and the entire society becomes dysfunctional. You see, a chain is only as strong as its weakest link. If one organ of my body is dysfunctional, it affects all my other organs. So the main problem is, if there is chronic Islamophobia, it not just affects Muslims, the entire society, the entire nation becomes, as a result, dysfunctional.
Well, we have the direct impact on American Muslims, the immediate victims of hate crimes or bias incidents, the discrimination and bigotry for people who are visibly Muslim, like myself, wearing a head covering in the workplace and in other places. We have attacks and concerns and fear out in the public, when you're on a train, when you're on a bus, when people are getting harassed and assaulted. I myself have been verbally assaulted when I've been out on the street just walking. So this has sort of become so common that pretty much any American Muslim that I speak to, they have certain stories that they can share. Islamophobia does not just hurt me. These issues are very connected, and the fear that it engenders really supports authoritarian principles or ideas. And that really strips all Americans, all of us, of our civil rights and liberties. People are much more willing when they're fed with this, and I wouldn't even say excessive fear, although that's the case. I would describe it as manipulated fear. This manipulated fear, which results in scapegoating, is really used both to win elections sometimes, because people can garner political points that way, but beyond that, to really attack our shared American values like religious freedom, to really strip all Americans of certain rights and freedoms and liberties that we have taken for granted. So it really is an attack on all of us as Americans, and we should all speak out, because in the name of national security, people are willing to give up their rights, and that national security framework is really manipulated by this fear that is engendered in communities.
You've alluded to this, and so I might ask, is this basically personal prejudice, personal fear that has ballooned, or does it go deeper than that?
So if I could start, I think I was shocked at the fact that there's a Islamophobia industry that spends over $30 million a year, made up of about 30 or so major organizations. And their messaging, which they research very carefully to see if it's effective, is echoed by about 40 media organizations and by many bloggers, many of them Christian pastors, like Franklin Graham or Eric Metaxas, who just promote this messaging. And I was even more shocked to find out that in the current administration, Mike Pompeo, Secretary of State, John Bolton, who's the National Security Advisor, are both a part of or have been spokespeople at Islamophobia organization events.
A few years ago, particularly when I used to go to the airports to travel, I used to have the lady at the counter tell me, "Sir, with great enthusiasm, you have been selected for some special screening," you see. And it was, beautifully intentioned, but that used to happen so often. And so, for me, it's not just a personal prejudice. It has become a part of the institution. And then when in the presidential campaign last November, when one presidential candidate said, "I would never allow a Muslim to be a member of the cabinet," it has become an institution, or institutionalized at the highest level of government. So for me personally, when I go out and speak, make presentations about Islam, in a sense, November elections has helped my business. More people attend. But now also there's a much more sort of accepted, organized group of people trying to disrupt the meeting. People coming to my face and saying, "You're a liar, you're a liar." I've never experienced this before. So it has become, in that sense, the new normal. Yes. And that for me is very dangerous.
We talked about women in Islam and sort of the negative portrayals there that are contrary to reality. But another area that I'll mention it is with respect to violence. In our country, over 90%, if not more, on American soil of mass violence and any kinds of sort of acts of terrorism are committed by non-Muslims. Well over 90%. In fact, white men are the biggest sort of perpetrators of this kind of violence. Yet the narrative portrays Muslims, people like us, as opposed to people like you two,
Right.
as the main source of fear. And when a white man, for instance, if they're Christian or not, and whether they do it based on their religion or not, when they commit certain acts, that is seen as that individual, as opposed to the whole group and collective blame that comes with it. Whereas when minority communities, particularly Muslims, engage in similar sort of bad behavior, which of course we denounce all kinds of behavior like that, when that happens, it is attributed to the entire group and to the faith. This is part of that promoting this false narrative.
What impact is this having on the young people in your mosques, in your groups?
That impact is really huge. And honestly, that's one of the areas that bothers me the most. There was a study, a Muslim doll study, that sort of followed the example of the black doll study that has been done historically to show the internalized forms of racism that people, especially kids, seem to adopt from mainstream culture and society. People are sometimes embarrassed or ashamed to call themselves Muslim. They change their names. They choose to sort of change the way they present themselves because of the impact. So those are all really, really dangerous parts because it results in a lot of other damage down the road. But having said that, there's also a lot of positivity. With this new generation, you're seeing some young people really embrace their faith and embrace their identity and just be proud and vocal about their identity, far more so than some of their parents even. And in fact, a lot of people are surprised that oftentimes it's younger generations who choose to wear a head covering, for instance, to visibly identify themselves as Muslims, to the sort of backlash of their parents even. We're seeing that happen. So there's sort of both sides of it.
I just want to echo what Sister Aneelah is saying. It has certainly a very severe, damaging impact on children because it does not allow them to evolve into the fullness of their being. They become incomplete. That's the downside of it. Also, there's an upside. When I visit schools, I begin to realize that, not always, but quite often in that age group, there's a lot of support. For example, a person says, yeah, I've heard all about these things here, but it's a white girl. She says, my best friend is actually a Pakistani girl. A boy later, another white person. My best friend is actually from Somalia. So that gives me a lot of hope that among the younger generation, they are really standing their ground and going beyond these silos that we build when we're adults and the baggage that we carry.
So the question I think that comes up next, and Terry, I know you've been doing a lot of work in this, is what is most helpful for Christians, Jews, even those not participating in a formal faith community? What would be most helpful for us to do to support our Islamic brothers and sisters, your communities?
So Jesus was a public leader in a community where everyone was being divided against each other, right? He was a public leader. And so I would encourage Christians to do what Jesus did. So he spoke to a Syrophoenician woman, he spoke to a Canaanite woman, he spoke to Samaritans. He went and stayed in a Samaritan village, which was a total no-no, right? So what did Jesus do? Jesus crossed those boundaries and recognized the humanity of people that were different. He could have easily developed a more cohesive group by othering Samaritans. But when he was asked, who is my neighbor? He told a story about a Samaritan, not how his own people should be kind to a Samaritan, but how the Samaritans had it in their tradition and their own humanity, the capacity to be kind to a Jewish person who was vulnerable. So first, I encourage Christians to go deep into our own tradition and recognize that anytime someone drew a circle and said the good humans are here, the bad humans are here, Jesus crossed that boundary and joined the people who were being dehumanized.
I just want to say quickly with Terry that what you have said that non-Muslims must do, we Muslims must also do the same thing. We always say, can we share 3 cups of tea? Listen, respect, connect. Then no matter what our differences, religious, political, racial, cultural, they might remain. But now it no longer looms as a threat. No longer possible for me to demonize or dehumanize the other.
Terry also mentions the power of the potluck when we're out at these road shows. And it's so true. Just getting people together and breaking bread together. You know, we at the Muslim Association of Puget Sound, we have quarterly open house programs. We have a number of other interfaith events that we promote and participate in. And we welcome our neighbors of all faith backgrounds or no faith backgrounds to join us in those. And there's also other opportunities like the Faith Action Network, which is a statewide network of different congregations for people to join some of the activities of FAN, or the Church Council of Greater Seattle, or Shoulder to Shoulder, which is a national organization bringing together people of different faith backgrounds to stand with their American Muslim neighbors. This is what we need to see. And one additional advice or one additional way that people can truly be allies, besides informing themselves and connecting personally, is really using the mainstream media, using the power of media, letters to the editor, op-eds, whatever public platform people have, to not to debate or argue theology, but really to share personal stories. Because in this day and age, facts don't change hearts. You know, what really changes hearts and minds is the personal connections, and short of that, the personal stories. And people can talk about the stories of the American Muslims that they know, and those personal stories can hopefully stop the dehumanization machinery that is in place.
See, the universe is not made out of atoms. It's made out of stories.
There you go.
Definitely, and this has been an outstanding opportunity to provide such stories. And I think you've also given people that are wondering, what can I do in my community, a sense of what they can do, and to look out certainly for the opportunities to attend some of the events that each of you do. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
I hope you'll come back, and I thank each of you for joining us on this Challenge 2.0. Join us again next week.